So in today's lesson, I'm going to discuss male and female reproductive hormones. So we're going to start with the male reproductive hormones. In order to do that, we need to remind you of some basics of the male and female anatomy along the way, so that you can understand when I discuss a particular part of the anatomy that you know where that hormone is coming from or going to. So the male gonads, yes, that's a word, is the testis. So testis is singular, testes is plural, testicle is kind of like the English word we use for that. And that is where, why are we discussing that? That's where the male gametes or sex cells are produced. So if we're looking at the male anatomy and we look at the scrotal sac, inside that you'll find the testis. And if we zoom in on the testis, we'll be able to see these little tubules called seminiferous tubules. And zooming in even further into that, you'll see that that is where sperm are actually produced. And in very close proximity, you'll see that there are specialized cells that are therefore secreting the hormone testosterone. So the female gonads, the female sex cell producing organs, are the ovaries, of course, and that's where eggs or ova are produced. So let's take a quick look at that. So if we were to look at a cross-section of the female reproductive system, what you see are two ovaries, one on each side, and then you have these fallopian tubes, one on each side. And what's interesting about this is you can see at the end of each fallopian tube are sort of like these finger-like projections. They're called fimbria. So the fallopian tubes are not actually connected to the ovary. They're just kind of close together, so that when an egg is released from the ovary, it has to make its way to the fallopian tube and then travel through the fallopian tube to the uterus. So here's the uterus. The cervix is essentially just this opening that connects the vagina to the uterus, and the endometrium is this sort of thick vascular tissue that lines the uterus, and we're going to see how it's involved in menstruation. So let's get back to the ovary. So the ovary, if we were to zoom in on it and look at a cross-section, this should look somewhat familiar because we tackled that just slightly in grade 11 biology. So unlike with men, women are born with all of their ova that are not really fully matured, and so once a month, every month at the beginning of puberty, one of these primary oocytes matures and then is released from the ovary. But we will get into that detail a little bit later. So although it's not the intent of this particular video to go into the details of human reproduction, I do want to remind you that it is a haploid egg cell and a haploid sperm cell that fuse to form a diploid zygote, and that will eventually form into the embryo and then the fetus. So if we look at this, we have our oocyte that begins after the ovary releases the mature follicle. And fertilization doesn't actually happen in the uterus. A lot of people think it does, but it doesn't. It happens in the fallopian tube. And in fact, that can cause problems because sometimes this fertilized egg can implant itself in the walls of the fallopian tube, and that can cause internal hemorrhaging and death even in the woman who's pregnant at the time. So if we look at each of these stages of zygote development, I believe we did that last year in one of our biology labs, then eventually at the point where the embryo the zygote is ready to implant itself into the wall of the uterus, we're looking at days 6 to 7, and at that point it's called a blastocyst. So 6 to 7 days after initial fertilization is when an implantation actually occurs.
Ms. Vandenberg, to the office, please.
Okay, so now we're ready to start talking about the endocrine system and how it relates to the male and female reproductive hormones. The male reproductive hormone that people tend to think about is testosterone. I'm sure you would have guessed that had we been in class. I want to remind you that that our steroids will have that sort of four-ring structure, and so when I look at this, I can tell that it's likely to be one of our steroid or lipid-soluble hormones. So it has a few functions, and you'll find that many of the hormones that we're going to talk about today will have more than one function. So one of them is obviously the production of those mature sperm cells. So without testosterone, those sperm cells will not be able to mature and assist in fertilization. Again, not the intent of this lesson to go through the details of this because it was looked at last year. But, you know, sperm cells, before they're ready to and capable of fertilizing an ovum, have to go through maturation. And again, that's happening in the seminiferous tubules of the male gonads. And eventually that results in 4 haploid cells per primordial germ cell. And as you were probably taught in your Fully Alive class in elementary school, testosterone is also going to be responsible for those, what we call the secondary male sex characteristics, right? So we're going to see, testes and penis maturing and enlarging. We're going to see that testosterone will play a role in sex drive. At puberty, all of a sudden you start to have maybe more crushes on girls and so on and so forth. A development of facial and body hair. So deepening of the voice, and that's mostly because your larynx is enlarging and thickening, and as air passes across your larynx, the vibrations are a little bit different. That causes a little bit of crackling that you hear, and your voice will get deeper. Also, along with all these other wonderful symptoms, we're going to see body oils increase in production. So that's going to result in potentially a little bit of acne, whereas you may not have had any before, and as well as some body odor. So aside from testosterone, there are 3 other hormones that we need to be concerned about in reference to the male reproductive hormones. So the first is luteinizing hormone, which we can abbreviate LH. And the role of LH is to stimulate that testosterone being produced in the testes. The second one is what we call follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. And as the name suggests, well, the follicle is the sperm in this case. So the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, is going to stimulate sperm production and maturation. So there's more to this coming. It's going to get complicated, so I'm going to do my best to break it down. So I want to remind you before we go any further about just the anatomical aspect of this, which is, our hypothalamus is here in the brain along with our pituitary, and they're very close. And the anterior lobe is responsible for the secretion of some important hormones here. So together with the male gonad, the testes, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are also each secreting separate functional hormones. Okay, so both luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are going to be released by the pituitary gland, and but they operate on a negative feedback loop, which means that there is a set point in terms of the amount of LH and FSH at certain points that ought to be in the bloodstream, and we need to control that. So this is how it sort of works. The hypothalamus at puberty, when we're looking at the body developmentally being and also social emotionally being ready to think about reproduction, then the hypothalamus is going to release gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. And so what GnRH does when it's released from the hypothalamus, is it's going to signal to the pituitary gland to start to release both LH and FSH. And so what's going to happen once FSH and LH are released? Well, we're going to just start to see testosterone being released, and it's going to create those secondary sex characteristics. And what is LH going to do? Or sorry, FSH? FSH is going to start the sperm maturing. And it's actually high testosterone levels that are being detected in the bloodstream that are going to be the part of the feedback loop that goes back and lets the pituitary and the hypothalamus know that no more LH needs to be released. So again, the loop will be that, so if we need at puberty to start testosterone and sperm maturation, that the hypothalamus is going to signal to the pituitary, and the pituitary is going to, by way of GnRH. The pituitary is going to secrete LH and FSH, and those are going to result in testosterone release and sperm production. Once the level of testosterone in the bloodstream becomes high enough, then it will feed back to the pituitary to inhibit LH, and the LH will feed back to the GnRH and slow it down. I hope that was simple enough. If you have any questions, save them for tomorrow, hopefully, and we will chat.